I think it's time we're going to have to get underway. Could I have your attention, please? To begin this afternoon's session, Dr. Charles Coburn says he is not going to speak on cooperative international clinical trials that establish safety and efficacy of live poliovirus vaccine, but he's going to speak on a surprise.
I'll tell you what you could do for me is pour a glass of water. I shall need it before the end. I can push it around the other way. How's that? Is that right? Dr. Horstman, ladies and gentlemen, yes, I've changed the title for various reasons. One is because no one asked me what I was going to talk about, so I don't see why I shouldn't talk about what I want to talk about, and that is going beyond the early studies of polio vaccine. My title is Cooperative International Studies on the Established Sabin Vaccine. I did this because I was not associated with the early studies in Russia and so on, and it would really be presumptuous of me to talk about them while Albert and others who were so closely involved have already done so well. Then I thought I'd just take a second to say something about the difference between a new vaccine and an established vaccine. When you start off with some new vaccine, especially if you have someone with the charisma of Albert behind it, you don't have an enormous problem in setting up a satisfactory series of field trials. But when you've got the answer to efficacy and some information about safety, the original researchers tend to disappear from the scene and go and cultivate more profitable fields. And the community, the national government, is left with the problem of how to continue monitoring efficacy and safety. Now, that's bad enough in any individual country, but obviously it's much more difficult in an international setting. So what I would like to do is talk briefly about what WHO has been doing in about the last 2 decades. First of all, when the vaccine came along, the normal routine procedures were gone through. International requirements for live poliovirus vaccine were promulgated so that individual countries could use them, if they wanted to, as a basis for their own control measures. And then later on, Dr. Drozdov, who was associated with Dr. Chumakov, and who now, in fact, is director of the Institute, he and I, while he worked in Geneva, produced a series of annual reports on the incidence of polio. Not very satisfactory in many ways, but at least they showed the contrast between what was happening in developed and developing countries. But these are our routine procedures in the WHO. In connection with the Sabin vaccine, a good deal further work was done. And in 1969, at one of the regular meetings of the heads of virus reference centers, and also backed by a number of consultants to the virus program, WHO was advised to set up a study of this old problem of the relationship between acute persisting paralysis and the use of poliomyelitis vaccines in different countries. And in due course, we were able to set up such a study. We succeeded in obtaining the collaboration of 11 countries who were prepared to provide information on cases, on the vaccines used, and on the immunization programs which they had adopted. Now, after a short time, one of these countries withdrew for the following reason. The authorities, convinced that the disease had been eradicated, had decreed that the diagnosis poliomyelitis would no longer be accepted in the official records. Two other countries withdrew for more understandable reasons. So that left us with 8. And then 5 others came in, so that we ended up with 13 countries. And the study which was made was continued over 10 years. It was very difficult to continue obtaining information of the relatively small number of cases which were occurring over this period of 10 years. And Fakhri Assad knows very well many of the problems we encountered. I may say that the USA and the UK were 2 countries which were not at all forward in producing their annual returns to us. And then there were great difficulties when we had the information in determining how to use it, because it was very variable in terms of the type of immunization program which was carried out, the availability of laboratory services, and the different standards of clinical diagnosis. All made the analysis of the data very complicated. As Albert never failed to point out at the meetings which he attended on this subject. However, in due course, a report was published, and I don't want to say too much about it, because Dr. Savin has left the room. Perhaps he realizes I was going to say that he might not agree with the conclusions. But no, I hope not. At any rate, quite simply, we found 1 or 2 things which I think were agreed to by most people. One was that we confirmed that there was a problem of paralysis, particularly with type 3, but as Bob Chanik said earlier, the problem was infinitely small. However, there were 2 countries which did not follow that normal trend. And both had a very high incidence of vaccine-associated cases. One mainly with type 3 in vaccinated children, and the other with type 2 in contacts. In the country with the type 2 cases, the incidence fell rapidly over the 10-year period, during which the vaccine, which in fact was made in another country, during which the vaccine was submitted to much more detailed control, and instead of giving individual types at different periods, the triple vaccine was used for the campaign. In country 2, that was. And in country 3, in which type 3 was the main problem, the high incidence continued year after year, except during one vaccination campaign, when the type 2 and type 3 components prepared by the country laboratories, the country's own laboratories, could not be used, and vaccine from another source was substituted, and in that year, no cases occurred. However, we never really found out exactly why these differences occurred in these 2 countries, but it seems fairly clear. The one was that the vaccine lots being used were not being very exhaustively tested before they were put into the field, and the other was, frankly, that the country concerned could not make the vaccine. I may say that one of Albert's comments about these 2 countries was, and I think it probably was pretty pertinent, he said, If a country which is preparing and using my vaccine finds cases of paralysis associated with it, then the strains which I handed over must have been altered and are no longer Savin strains. Now, I think, in fact, he probably had quite a lot of truth in what he was saying, but that's not why he said it, I mean. He said it because he strongly objected to our conclusions. There was something else which we observed, and this is something which Bob mentioned today, and this is in disagreement with Dr. Chanik now. I think there was fairly good evidence that the neurovigilance test did not always provide an absolute indication that the vaccine was safe in children. The evidence was as follows. The vaccines used in that country, which had a high type 3 incidence over a period of years, were tested in very competent laboratories, I think in BOB and in Dr. Shields' laboratory also, and were perfectly satisfactory in the neurovigilance, interspinal neurovigilance test. That was one observation. The second was that a batch of type 3 vaccine which passed the neurovigilance tests in a number of laboratories and which was prepared from an ampoule of the same original seed as that used earlier for some millions of children, was found to cause paralysis when used on a small scale prior to proposed large-scale use. Now, so far as I recall, the only apparent difference between the original ampoule, which was safe, and the sister ampoule, which was not, was that the seed from the sister ampoule was grown up on human diploid cells, whereas the other was on monkey kidney. Whether that made a difference, I don't know. Nonetheless, the point is the vaccine passed the test and definitely caused cases of paralysis in the controlled study which we were making before it was issued for general use. And then the third piece of evidence was that a vaccine prepared from a strain of type 3 which had nothing to do with the Savin strains at all, but which was repeatedly found to be less virulent than the Leon strain in comparative neurovigilance tests, was associated very definitely with cases and contacts in 2 countries which were carrying out small-scale studies. Now, I don't mean to say that the interspinous tests have no value, but I think perhaps it does indicate that any test, any marker test, has still got to be checked by epidemiological observation just to make certain that it isn't changing its character in any way. Now, another curious observation was that though as a result of comparative tests in monkeys, the consensus of investigators' opinion was that seed from the lowest possible passage of virus should be used. There was in those studies which we made no clear-cut evidence that higher passage level vaccine carried a greater risk than lower passage level vaccine in children. What the meaning of that is, I don't know. Well, some 3 years after these studies had begun, WHO's involvement with the Savin vaccine greatly increased. As you all know, Dr. Savin himself decided which laboratories should produce his vaccine. And to them, he not only provided the strains, but to a large extent, he controlled the production process. Early in 1972, he wrote to me at WHO saying he thought the time had come to hand over responsibility for the custody and distribution of his strains, as well as his supervisory and advisory role on vaccine production, and asked if WHO would consider taking on this task. Now, we who are concerned with the more technical side of the work of WHO were very keen that this offer should be accepted because it gave us, or gave WHO, a clear and specific task to do on a practical activity of continuing world importance. So accordingly, Dr. Sabin, on his next visit to Europe, visited Geneva and formally agreed with the Director General, Dr. Kanda, that WHO should lift the burden from his shoulders. Later that day, I met Dr. Kanda and said to him, were you pleased with the way the meeting went this morning? And he said, oh, well, yes, it was all right. He said, after all, the strains are your problem, it's not my problem. But what I am a little disappointed, because I was looking forward to meeting Mrs. Sabin, and she wasn't there. So, the reason for it, of course, was that both Mrs. Sabin and Dr. Kanda were from Brazil, and Dr. Kanda knew Mrs. Sabin's family at an earlier stage. At any rate, his disappointment wasn't too severe. And in his annual report at the next meeting of the World Health Assembly, he said, and I quote, "One particular development last year may be of interest to the Assembly. In June 1972, Dr. Albert Sabin proposed that WHO should accept responsibility, hitherto exercised personally by Dr. Sabin himself, of approving laboratories which want to produce poliovirus vaccines from the seed materials of the Sabin strains for types 1, 2, and 3. Dr. Sabin, in his generosity, has never patented his strains, and he wished them to continue to be available to producers who could show themselves competent to prepare effective and safe vaccines. Since it would be potentially dangerous if the strains were made available indiscriminately, the Director General agreed to assume personally the responsibility of ensuring the proper employment of the strains and is establishing a scientific committee to advise on all matters pertaining to their use." Now, the World Health Assembly, as you probably know, includes delegates from every member country of the organization. And Dr. Kanda's announcement, which was made in one of the plenary sessions, had one unexpected effect. A number of the countries which hitherto had never shown the slightest interest in producing polio vaccines suddenly decided that they would like to do so, which created a certain amount of alarm and despondency. And so one of the first pieces of work which the expert group which had been set up to deal with the matter, one of the first pieces of work they had to do was to produce a document entitled WHO Conditions for the Distribution and Use of Poliomyelitis Vaccine Strains. And the main tenor of this document was to say as clearly and as diplomatically as possible why additional countries should not become involved in such a technically complicated and financially taxing activity, especially as the vaccine could be purchased much more cheaply from the established producers. I'm glad to say that this sort of negative thou shalt not approach was one of the most positive successes of the group, and without exception all the candidate producers withdrew from the brink. However, at that time there were a few laboratories just about to begin large-scale production, and arrangements had to be made for representatives of the committee to inspect them. Among the first was the Razi Institute, Tehran. Dr. Sabin had been associated with a scheme for Japan to provide the working seed to the Tehran laboratory so that production should not be delayed. And when we visited, we found that Dr. Mir Shamsi, who many of you know, I'm sure, had set up a very effective production line. Some of the other visits, however, were less happy. Either the buildings or the process or the quality of the staff, or all three were unsatisfactory. And we had some difficulty in dissuading them from producing vaccine until such time as they had made the necessary improvements. Once these urgent matters were attended to, the group prepared a program of visits to already established production laboratories. And one of these visits, which we made, was by a group which included Dr. Sabin and Heloisa when we went to the USSR, which was a really memorable event in many ways. I think all of you would appreciate the sparkling exchanges between Dr. Sabin and Dr. Chumakov upon occasion, ably interpreted by someone who is, all of you have been there must know, Bila Kaplan, who stood between them and did her best for both sides. But don't let me give the wrong impression. In fact, this was a very friendly and a very constructive review of the production methods and the strains which are being used in the USSR. And I'm sorry that Dr. Chumakov's not here to talk more about that. Now, the next thing which the group became interested in was characterizing the strains already being used in the production laboratories. And this owed quite a lot to Frank Perkins, who at that stage became a member of the WTO staff and in fact took over the secretaryship of this group. I shan't say anything more about that because I see my time is nearly up, and I would like to show an example as the first speaker this afternoon, not to go beyond my 20 minutes. But what I will just mention is that one of the most positive pieces of work which was done in that period was the production from Dr. Sabin's original ampoules of new seed virus for all three strains. And this was carried out by Dr. Mauler and Beringwerker with Dr. Perkins as advisor. The tests were made in the National Biological Control Laboratories in the USA, the UK, in Beringwerker itself, and I think in Italy. And all this work was done absolutely free of any cost to WHO or to any of the countries. Now, these seeds are now held in the gas phase of liquid nitrogen at Beringwerker, the BOB Bethesda, NIBSC in London, and in WHO Geneva. It may well be, of course, that recent work in molecular biology will change the direction of vaccine development and vaccine production. And perhaps the present seed virus system may change considerably. But nevertheless, I think we should salute at this time Dr. Mauler and Dr. Beringwerker's efforts and that of the testing laboratories for their generosity in this enormous task which they carried out. Dr. Sabin, this is a very brief account of the stewardship of the World Health Organization and his group of consultants in the preservation and continuing use and study of your unique strains. I have no doubt that the organization will apply in future the same sense of responsibility for these strains as that expressed by Dr. Kandau now nearly 15 years ago. And I hope, sir, that you feel that your confidence in handing over to WHO was not displaced. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Coburn. Your reference to the Russians and Dr. Sabin's collaboration with them certainly brought back many memories to me too, and that important collaboration I hope will bear more fruit in the future. Next, we will hear from Dr. Charles Stewart Harris on evaluation of safety and efficacy of live poliovirus vaccine. Charles? Let's go in the middle.
Madam Chairman, and ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Sabin and I have had contact over the years quite intermittently, but they have been throughout permeated by a sense of great warmth. And I was one of those who was at the Rockefeller at the time that he was working there, soon after the war, before the war actually. And I remember him showing me cultures in surviving cells of brain in which he was attempting to grow strains of poliomyelitis virus. And I was also present at the international meeting on polio soon after the war, at which he said that his findings that the virus was strictly neurotropic may have held up progress in other ways, in other laboratories, and how sorry he was for this. And it stood out to me at that time that very few people are prepared to acknowledge publicly any form of error, or certainly take any responsibility for such an occasion. Now, in an article published in December 1960, John Paul asked the question whether, because live attenuated polioviruses tend to show reversion away from attenuation of virulence on passage through the alimentary tract, will such strains revert to a fully virulent form? He answered the question by saying that the final answer to this conundrum had not yet been assessed. Today, many years afterwards, one can say that 25 years of experience since Dr. Paul posed the question have ended in a consistently negative answer. To begin with the experience before 1960, from the millions of children vaccinated in the USSR, which included a large percentage of previous seronegatives, from trials in Czechoslovakia and Mexico, and not forgetting those in Cincinnati and Rochester, New York in the spring of 1960, no hint of any conceivable risk had resulted from the use of Sabin's vaccine. Since those early days, which I remember with a sense of deep emotion, satisfactory progress in efficacy as well as in safety have continued to be experienced in the developed nations of the world. The recommendations in 1960 of the Expert Committee on Poliomyelitis of the World Health Organization that these strains of poliomyelitis vaccine, this is the Sabin strains, approached more closely the optimum of low monkey neuropathogenicity than other strains of vaccine, represented a significant and convincing gain. From then onwards, the strains sponsored by Dr. Savin represent the best of the competing attenuated polioviruses. Now, a little bit about the history of evaluation of vaccine in the United Kingdom. When the rapid development and initial tests of the appropriate viruses of all three poliovirus serotypes had been completed, the authorities responsible for public health in the various countries considered what next should be done. In Great Britain, an understanding of the behavior of Sabin live attenuated poliovirus vaccine given orally, either to small groups of segregated children or on a massive scale in the face of an epidemic, had already been achieved without any adverse effect being encountered. The Ministry of Health and the Public Health Laboratory Service therefore set up a surveillance scheme in 1962 in order to meet the theoretical possibility of a very small proportion of children and adults receiving the vaccine or their contacts of becoming paralyzed from the virus. This was the least possible indicator of a breach in the security of the safety of oral vaccine. And 4 circumstances to obviate this were defined. First one was an undue frequency of poliomyelitis in recently vaccinated persons. Secondly, aggregation of dates of onset of illness within a month of vaccination between 5 and 28 days before. Thirdly, an undue frequency of cases associated with a single batch or small number of batches of vaccine. And finally, 4, an age, sex, season, and geographical location of vaccine-associated cases. It was indeed known at that time that very few cases of paralysis had occurred in the USA in vaccinated persons, which might have been caused by the monovalent type 3 vaccine which had been used. There was already in existence in Britain a committee charged with overall responsibility for the vaccine, so-called Cohen Committee, but early in 1963 a new committee was appointed under my chairmanship. This, the Poliomyelitis Vaccine Committee, took over the responsibility of supervising the reports on surveillance issued by the Epidemiological Department of the Central Public Health Laboratory in London. Can we have the first slide, please?
Press forward.
Oh, press forward. Well, this shows the incidence of poliomyelitis vaccine, polio cases, rather, in Great Britain. And the Salk vaccine was introduced in 57, and was used for the first few years. And it was accompanied by this steep fall. This is 1,000 cases in a year. And then in 1962, a complete change occurred when we changed over to Savin vaccine, and from then onwards we had really quite encouraging results, and the incidence was brought to a low level. The first report from the epidemiologists was by Miller and Galbraith in 1965. Now, this was the most critical time for the use of live oral vaccine in England, for by 1964, 2 million children and young adults under 21 had then completed primary immunization with 3 doses of trivalent vaccine, and nearly 500,000 adults as well. A total of another 3 million persons received oral vaccines to complete primary immunization begun with Salk vaccine or to provide a booster dose. And this is the experience in those years. The oral vaccine began in that year, in March, and subsequently, and then the numbers of cases of paralytic polio that were notified fell down to 16 or 20 in 1967 and 68. The safety of the vaccine had to be judged firstly by means of the number of cases of paralysis occurring from the 5th to the 28th day after its administration, excluding such cases arising in the first 4 days after vaccination. There were 30 such patients, only 4 of which were taken ill on or after the 5th day. And these incidents took place during the first 3 years since the start of oral immunization. And they represented for the recipients of vaccine an attack rate of 1.6 per million doses of vaccine which had been given. Subsequent history of poliomyelitis in Britain is shown in the next 2 slides. The annual number of cases of disease had declined appreciably throughout the period to below 10, and this good experience lasted until 1976. Miller et al. In 1970 reported that after 1968, on the 3 years from 1965 to 68, during which a total of 169 cases, 91 of paralytic disease and 78 of non-paralytic polio were recorded. A flurry of cases occurred in Blackburn in 1936, and this particular one was not in any way a sort of focal distribution, though there were in fact a number of cases which occurred, and it was found that the Medical Officer of Health considered that it was not ethical to give oral vaccine, and he had been going on using Salk vaccine throughout. It was due to type 1 poliovirus. Now, in the later phases of experience, up to 1985, you'll see that the experience on the whole was pretty good. 1976 and 77 were the days with 10 and 15 cases respectively, and then 78, 79 and 80. There's also put in on this slide the number of cases which were actually vaccine associated by the ordinary method, and these ones continued to be 1 or 2 cases per year. These were mostly living in well-separated communities, and they were, in fact, the increased incidence did not last. Now, collected series of cases in 1964. These cases, the collected series of patients during the next 28 days between 1962 and 1976. And these show the 3 series of surveillance procedures during which all cases were typed, and if a virus was obtained, and also the whole business was most carefully gone into by the epidemiological section of the Public Health Laboratory Service. You see that the numbers of cases fell, 14, 7, and then 6, 0.2 per million doses, and that's rather a long stretch. And then there were contact cases occurring in the form of a dribble running along after the actual vaccinated person. And these showed no tendency for any breaking up or any distribution different from the normal. The attack rate in these cases was running between 0.2 and 0.5 cases per million. And this shows that the distribution over 1962, from the beginning of the period, to 1972, of cases occurring in vaccinated persons. And here you see there's a very clear distinction between the cases occurring within the first few days after vaccine and the later period here. And it's in this later period that type 3 cases occur, and this goes on. And 2 cases were due to a different type of disease during this period. It's E. These cases then refer to the results of the whole series from the surveillance point of view, and the point really here is that the type 3 cases, a number of which were recovered during this later phase, may merely record the prolonged duration of excretion of this type of virus. And even the threat of the occurrence of type 3 cases does not significantly increase the burden on the community, because these are all single cases that occur. There's no tendency for contact infection, secondly, after the initial case. Now, during this time, another piece of evidence was being collected on the patients, and these are not actually patients, because a number of them were healthy children or adults, and these ones were tested when they were attending outpatients or something of that sort. And you'll see that the original cases of type 1 fell after the introduction of this Savin vaccine, and settled down to about 20 to 30 cases per year. And here's another group also of the same. And this series went on and continues, I suppose, at the present day, though I don't know of any actual investigations that are being made. So they indicate not only the fall in number of cases, but also the evidence from the survey that healthy children and adults are being infected as a result of contact, presumably in the community. The ultimate percentage of isolates from all 3 types was around 33%. And Dr. Savin has himself indicated the importance of this second form of contact immunization of previously susceptible persons in the community. In a recent article in 1982, in which he described or prescribed for the tropical and subtropical countries of the world annual national days of vaccination. In temperate climates, this frequent replacement of the wild natural flora by that derived from vaccine is seen to be a most important adjunct to the control of poliomyelitis, and one which has the capacity to spread from one person receiving the vaccine to all his or her domestic contacts. Now, in the interpretation of the excreted viruses found in healthy persons, much hope was at one time placed on the marker characteristics of the virus when searching for the origins of the latter. Yet, the very wide limits in the properties of the strains found in the feces of healthy persons before any attenuated vaccines had been used in the community showed that the relative virulence of the excreted viruses vary widely. Dr. Savin himself contributed to this in 1956, as was pointed out by Dr. Channock. Recently, molecular studies of the polioviruses have developed, both in England and the USA, a single alteration in the non-coding region of the genome caused by cytidine replacing uridine at position 472 is associated with a return of neurovirulence whenever it occurs. Such a minute alteration in chemical structure with profound biological effects leaves one speechless, and one hopes that Dr. Schild will enlighten us further. Slide off, please. Well, in conclusion, the history of the experience of poliomyelitis in England and Wales affords a secure position in these countries by their almost total freedom from poliomyelitis. The occasional imported case of the disease from other countries, and particularly from India, has not been followed by a spread of disease to those in contact with the patient. The efficacy and the safety of Sabin's vaccine have been abundantly proved to be true. Thank you very much, Dr. Savin. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart Harris. Finally, in this group of papers, we hear from Dr. Assad on strategy for control of poliomyelitis in developing countries by mass immunization, a favorite subject of Dr. Savin.
Well, without any further introduction, this is the subject of health policies, or actually politics. I don't know why I have been assigned this, but I will take you then through words and phrases that we use all the time in the World Health Organization that are not frequently used in highly technical or scientific gatherings, but which in WHO have lots of meanings. And not only this, we are steered by them in our technical programs. The mass immunization campaign against poliomyelitis per se, as opposed to the continued availability of a number of vaccines, including poliomyelitis vaccine, throughout the year, raises questions of efficacy, efficiency, cost effectiveness, etc., but only on the surface. The question raised, in fact, touches on the more fundamental problem, as I said, of health policies or health politics. The turning point in the delivery of health services was heralded in the joint WHO-UNICEF International Conference on Primary Health Care in Alma-Ata, USSR, in 1978. I will read two of the declarations of the Alma-Ata. One of them, economic and social development based on a new international economic order is of basic importance to the fullest attainment of health for all and to the reduction of the gap between the health status of the developing and developed countries. The promotion and protection of health of the people is essential to sustained economic and social development and contributes to a better quality of life and to world peace. Second one, primary health care is essential health care based on practical, scientifically sound, and socially acceptable methods and technology made universally accessible to individuals and families in the community through their full participation and at a cost that the community and country can afford to maintain at every stage of their development in the spirit of self-reliance and self-determination. WHO's commitment to health for all by the year 2000 and the following of a primary health care approach for its attainment is total, is not just a slogan. With this avowed commitment to primary health care, a fight has been simmering between two proponents. One, the so-called development, that is the so-called advocates of the process, and the adherence to the problem reduction or the so-called programs. Let me explain what I mean by this. Very briefly, what does the polemic of process versus program actually signify? The proponents of process declare that health in the long term is part and parcel of development. A disease reduction technology, however effective it has proved to be in the developed world, will not be sustained in the developing world unless it becomes an integral part of the overall development of the country. The program school, on the other hand, simply states, use the powerful tools one has available to reduce death and suffering. Health workers should deliver effective disease control interventions, should seize the chance of using health technologies as the tool for social change. And just let us witness the latest in child survival effort, immunize all the children by the 1990. This is the effort that is being advocated by UNICEF, WHO, Rockefeller, namely immunize all children before 1990. Now, how far apart these two schools of thought are, and are they really irreconcilable? This is what I would like to give. But before then, let us go, what do we mean by mass campaigns? The success of the smallpox eradication program engendered the hope for repeating the same experience with other diseases. An international conference on eradication of infectious diseases was organized by the Fogarty International Center in 1980. Measles, poliomyelitis, and yos were chosen as model diseases for eradication. There was an international symposium on measles immunization in Washington in March 1982. There were two on yos, one in Indonesia in 1985 for Southeast Asia and Western Pacific, and one in Congo in February 1986 for African region. There will be further regional conferences on yos. For polio, the meeting was held 14 to 17 March 1983. Fred Robbins summarized the conference, and this morning he mentioned some of it. So I will go only to the recommendation number 3 of the symposium. Although the eventual goal should be to incorporate polio vaccination into routine primary health care services, a flexible approach should be adopted. Special campaigns for polio vaccination should not be discouraged, particularly since they can be used to increase motivation of the government, professions, and public, and to develop an infrastructure oriented to public health. Each country will have to adapt its program to the peculiar situation extant at that time. This actually sounded like a compromise. But since then, however, there has been more and more attention being paid to campaigns. And this undoubtedly is for the leadership of Albert Sabin. I will cite here one thing. In May 1985, the director of the Pan American Health Organization announced the proposal to eradicate the indigenous transmission of poliovirus in the Americas by 1990. In July, a proposal for action was endorsed by the first meeting of the Technical Advisory Group on Polio Eradication, In September, PAHO's Directing Council approved a resolution declaring the goals established in the proposal for action as one of the major objectives of the organization. And in October, the first interagency coordinating committee meeting with representatives from the Pan American Health Bureau, UNICEF, and the US Agency for International Development, the International Development Bank, and the Rotary International was held to discuss how other agencies could support polio eradication activities. At the country level, immunization activities were accelerated by the initiation of national vaccination days in Peru, Paraguay, Ecuador, El Salvador, and Honduras. Several other countries, such as Colombia, Brazil, Bolivia, and the Dominican Republic, have already been using the strategy for a number of years. Now, let us go quickly through a historical background. Frank Fenner mentioned some of what I'm going to say, so you forgive me if I repeat some of it. The use of oral live attenuated Sabin vaccine in the fight against poliomyelitis started with a series of mass campaigns. In 1957, and I think this is one of the proud things that WHO has to give, an international committee convened by the World Health Organization under the chairmanship, as Frank mentioned, of the late Sir Macfarlane Burnet, recommended that trial of Sabin oral poliomyelitis vaccine be carried out on increasingly large numbers of people in different countries. I will jump one page and in on Sabin's words, it was possible before the summer of 1960 to give each of the three types of vaccine sequentially, not only to about 77 million persons in the Soviet Union and also in about 23 million in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, a total of about 100 million persons. The unprecedented, immediate, complete, or almost complete elimination of paralytic poliomyelitis caused by polioviruses by these mass administrations of oral polio vaccine in a short period of time was the most dramatic demonstrations of a new way to use vaccine. Many countries of Eastern Europe have kept this approach of mass campaigns up to today. In the USA, as just was mentioned by, just now really, the same thing happened. There was a Salk vaccine, and just to give you some figures, because I think they are really impressive. A record of low 2,499 cases of paralytic poliomyelitis in 1957. A slight increase in 1958 to 3,697. And in 1959, the number more than doubled to 6,289. In 1960, the number of cases was down to 2,500 or almost. In 1961, OPV Sabin was introduced in mass campaigns, the so-called polio Sundays and the like. And the annual number of paralytic cases decreased precipitously to around about 60 cases. I don't have to tell you how many cases the United States have now. In the developing world, I'll give you two contrasting situations. Cuba was the first developing country to use Sabin vaccine and in a mass campaign twice a year. And they have no polio for a long, long time. On the other hand, Kenya wanted to do something about this. They used lay volunteers in mass immunization campaign. And in 1972, they evaluated the whole thing, and here I cite Dr. Metzler's report. A program of nationwide poliomyelitis vaccination by lay volunteers can be considered useful as an emergency measure only when an epidemic threatens. And I'll come back to why that contrast. In 1974, the World Health Assembly established the Expanded Program on Immunization, the so-called EPI, with OPV Sabin as one of the 6 antigens including the program. The 6 antigens, by the way, are tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, tuberculosis, measles, and polio. In the 70s, it was assumed that in the developing world, infection with polioviruses was ubiquitous, but accompanied with little overt illness. Dr. Horstman, who visited my own country, Egypt, during the war, may still remember that Egyptians were blaming the Americans for bringing polio to Egypt. And she investigated this because we don't have polio in adults. We are all exposed within the first year of life. However, the same year that EPI started, a lameness surveys started also in many countries. And the first one that was carried out in 1974 in Ghana demonstrated that there are 7 per 1,000 school children that have some paralysis. And the calculated annual incidence was estimated about 28 per 100,000 population. And further studies showed that the developing world may actually have an incidence that is higher than what United States suffered from before Salk or Sabin vaccines. However, in the developing world, up till now, is a purely infantile disease occurring very early in life. The EPI opted for the Sabin oral vaccine, but also for a strategy of continuous availability of the vaccine to the infant population. The central EPI strategy to date has been to deliver immunization in consonance with other health services, particularly those directed towards mothers and children. The long-term goal of such effort is to strengthen the health infrastructure so as to ensure the continuous provision of immunization and other primary health care services. I must say here that the program, when it started about 12 years ago, it was estimated that there were less than 2% of infants in the developing world that had 3 doses of Sabin vaccine. I think we can be still proud of having over 45% of children in the developing world having 3 doses of vaccine, of polio oral vaccine Sabin, before the end of their first year of life. We accept, however, that some countries have been very impatient with that progress. How come that toward the end of the 20th century, we are still having only 45,000? And there have been attempts to overcome this by campaigns. I will cite examples of the great successes, but also I will start with my own country, Egypt, and the difficulties they had in mounting mass campaigns. I think Egypt exemplifies the difficulties encountered by countries in the developing world in implementing such a campaign. Compulsory immunization with oral poliomyelitis vaccine was introduced as early as 65. However, by mid-70s, we had anything between 3,000 to 10,000 cases a year. In 76 and beginning of 77, a mass campaign was mounted, and the number of cases dropped by more than 70%. In 1977, we had 790 cases. In 78, however, it rose to 934 cases. And then from then onwards, started to increase again. A thorough investigation of cases occurring in 79, jointly by Egyptian authorities and WHO, showed that over 90% of cases had had no vaccine. The cases were concentrated in the overcrowded, socially underprivileged urban fringe populations. Not only this, it was found out that those who needed the vaccination in a country like Egypt, very early in life, are the ones who did not get it. But it was almost 2 years and over. So now they have started again with much more effective mass campaigns. It's too early to say where are we going, but let us hope that we will follow the example of a country that, thanks to the leadership of Albert, has done wonders, and that's Brazil. Certainly the example of Brazil has excited everybody. To get cases from over, well, thousands to less than 100 in 1 year only is certainly, and to be sustained as such, is certainly a feat. The 10-year health plan, but this is not, this is not restricted to Brazil. I think the example has been emulated by many other South American countries. The 10-year in the 70s, it was assumed that in the developing world, infection with polioviruses was ubiquitous, but accompanied with little overt illness. Dr. Horstman, who visited my own country, Egypt, during the war, may still remember that Egyptians were blaming the Americans for bringing polio to Egypt. And she investigated this, because we don't have polio in adults. We are all exposed within the first year of life. However, the same year that EPI started, a lameness surveys started also in many countries. And the first one that was carried out in 1974 in Ghana demonstrated that there are 7 per 1,000 school children that have some paralysis. And the calculated annual incidence was estimated about 28 per 100,000 population. And further studies showed that the developing world may actually have an incidence that is higher than what United States suffered from before Salk or Sabin vaccines. However, in the developing world, up till now, is a purely infantile disease occurring very early in life. The EPI opted for the Sabin oral vaccine, but also for a strategy of continuous availability of the vaccine to the infant population. The central EPI strategy to date has been to deliver immunization in consonance with other health services, particularly those directed towards mothers and children. The long-term goal of such effort is to strengthen the health infrastructure so as to ensure the continuous provision of immunization and other primary health care services. I must say here that the program, when it started about 12 years ago, it was estimated that there were less than 2% of infants in the developing world that had 3 doses of Sabin vaccine. I think we can be still proud of having over 45% of children in the developing world having 3 doses of vaccine, of polio oral vaccine Sabin, before the end of their first year of life. We accept, however, that some countries have been very impatient with that progress. How come that toward the end of the 20th century, we are still having only 45,000? And there have been attempts to overcome this by campaigns. I will cite examples of the great successes, but also I will start with my own country, Egypt, and the difficulties they had in mounting mass campaigns. I think Egypt exemplifies the difficulties encountered by countries in the developing world in implementing such a campaign. Compulsory immunization with oral poliomyelitis vaccine was introduced as early as 65. However, by mid-70s, we had anything between 3,000 to 10,000 cases a year. In 76 and beginning of 77, a mass campaign was mounted, and the number of cases dropped by more than 70%. In 1977, we had 790 cases. In 78, however, it rose to 934 cases. And then from then onwards, started to increase again. A thorough investigation of cases occurring in 79, jointly by Egyptian authorities and WHO, showed that over 90% of cases had had no vaccine. The cases were concentrated in the overcrowded, socially underprivileged urban fringe populations. Not only this, it was found out that those who needed the vaccination in a country like Egypt, very early in life, are the ones who did not get it. But it was almost 2 years and over. So now they have started again with much more effective mass campaigns. It's too early to say where are we going, but let us hope that we will follow the example of a country that, thanks to the leadership of Albert, has done wonders, and that's Brazil. Certainly the example of Brazil has excited everybody. To get cases from over, well, thousands to less than 100 in 1 year only is certainly, and to be sustained as such, is certainly a feat. The 10-year health plan, but this is not, this is not restricted to Brazil. I think the example has been emulated by many other South American countries. The 10-year health plan for the Americas in the 70s set regional targets. By 1984, the target for poliomyelitis, that is reported incidence of less than 0.1 per 100,000 population for 5 or more years, was being met by 26 countries, or 57% of the regional total number of countries. As mentioned above, in May 1985, the regional director, taking this in consideration, announced that Americas will eradicate polio before 1990. It would seem that countries in the third world, which are in the upper brackets of development, or to put it crudely, the really developing countries, and who are politically committing themselves to health goals and willing to put efforts in development, are those that have the best chance of mounting and sustaining annual mass immunization campaigns. I would like to cite some of the paragraphs that come in official WHO documents to really conclude how we feel in WHO. Not about only WHO, not about polio control, but how we can use Albert Sabin's leadership to enhance this program and to make sure that within the next decade we should have as low numbers of polio as we see in the developed countries. In 1982, under the egging of Albert Sabin, it became clear that without rapid acceleration, the EPI goal will not be met. In reviewing the program, in that year, the World Health Assembly endorsed a 5-point action program. I think here, the one thing is this, is that it's not only that we are 100% for primary health care, but we are starting to see other alternatives of getting that primary health care being achieved. The events in the Americas are demonstrating what a positive effect mass campaigns can have. And we should be learning some valuable lessons. And when we say we, actually, is WHO. Is learning some valuable lessons concerning what is required to sustain efforts initially made in the course of a campaign. The EAPI is extremely excited by the potential for polio elimination in the Americas and feels that this will serve as a critical step in launching a global eradication effort. I think this is the first time a number of you would have heard WHO pronouncing the word eradication of polio. The EPI believes that a healthy mix of approaches to polio immunization is being used in the Americas. The bottom line being whether the disease is controlled or not. This is certainly the philosophy WHO is pursuing in the rest of the world, attempting to build surveillance capabilities which will permit the use of disease incidence to guide the evolution of national strategies. And then this brings me then to the question I raised at the beginning of my talk, namely, what is the developmental process and what are the programmatic accelerated reduction of disease mean, really? Is it really a question of one or the other? I think we can say that a mass campaign, with all the organization it needs, the logistic support it entails, the community motivation, involvement demands, and above all, the prerequisite sustained political commitment that is all needed at all levels, maybe in many of the developing countries that have not sustained their own development, may be reduced to flogging an infrastructure that's already failing to provide basic services or is at most in the early stages of development. On the other hand, the same mass campaign strategy may be the welcome thrust to the effective rapid reduction of the load of disease and of a disease that everyone sees, notices, and knows. There is no mother that does not know paralytic polio in the developing world. To reducing this load of the disease and thereby permitting a really developing infrastructure to gain necessary momentum, the own process people call for. I will end my talk by Rafe Henderson, the program manager of EPI, and I quote from a letter of him, and it deals with Sabin and Sabin's leadership in this area. Open quotes. I know Dr. Sabin feels very frustrated with the slow responses we are making to his suggestions. Open brackets, mass immunization campaigns, using lay workers for administering the vaccine, close brackets, and can well sympathize with his impatience. He has an extremely clear vision of what can be done and has been an extremely effective catalyst in getting national immunization day strategies launched in a number of countries. There is no question in my mind that with the degree of political commitment he calls for from countries wishing to control polio and other vaccine preventable diseases, coupled with the strong centralized management he envisages, there are very few countries who could not achieve by 1999 immunization goal, which WHO has set. Dr. Sabin's great strength, in addition to his long experience and personal charisma, is his determination to see the world rid of polio as quickly as possible. His advocacy is an important element in making this happen. While we are not able to be as vigorous partners in this effort as we would like, we are nonetheless equally committed to this same goal and will hope to be good enough managers to continue to evolve and adapt our approaches based on the lessons being learned at the country level, including the lessons of the place of mass campaignation programs. Close quote. Dr. Sabin, I think you can rest assured that WHO will do its best to achieve the goals you have yourself set. Many thanks.
Well, I could trust you, but I didn't. Apparently, we've reached on time, the time for the coffee break. So if you will return in 20 minutes, everything will be fine.
May we please start this now? The press has let go of Albert, so we can start again. In the talk that I gave this morning, Albert quite correctly missed my recounting some personal recollections of the many experiences that we shared in the intense period of working together. I would have loved to lace my account with a few personal anecdotes and stories, but then we wouldn't have had time for any of the other 15 papers. I certainly couldn't have done justice to the arboviruses. But now, in this second incarnation, I have the microphone again, and Bob Channock tells me that possession of that instrument confers certain freedoms. I'd like to share with you just one sentimental reminiscence, because it is very dear to my heart. 40 years ago to the day, 40 years ago today, Albert and I sat on the roof of the Daiichi Hotel in Tokyo and all by ourselves celebrated his 40th birthday with a couple of Daiichi eggnogs, which consisted of Suntory whiskey mixed in equal parts with vanilla ice cream from the PX. It was wonderful. It was a good pause in a very, very busy summer. Now, unfortunately, I was too poor at that time to own a camera, and Albert had the only one between the two of us. And after we returned to the States, he sent me some of the prints, but the only one he sent me of that memorable occasion, which I almost was too modest to show, is this one. Can we dim that a little bit? That's not Albert. So I decided that that was the only one that I had of this memorable day. But a few weeks, 3 weeks before that day, Albert and I went on one of our, I think on a trip that both of us remember with very, very special sentimental and scientific, what should I say, poignancy. We went to China. Oh, I did it again. No. I told you, Saul, you shouldn't put them in the same.
Go backward.
I did.
Walter, to go backward, you hold your finger down a little longer. Backward.
I did that. There it is. One more. There we are. Okay, that was as we... Huh?
For all Kodak machines.
All right. We took off on this trip, and you recognize the two. Now I'm stuck forever. Well, that plane that you saw is the old B-25, beat up with a crew of 6 that Douglas MacArthur assigned to us to go to Tianjin to investigate an alleged epidemic or outbreak of Japanese encephalitis in Tianjin, China, which of course by then we knew was bulbar polio, but we went anyhow because Albert had his heart set, as I did, on my having an opportunity to visit my parents and my eldest brother, who were at that time and had been living throughout the war in Tianjin. And by God, I dropped in on them with Albert, and it was without any doubt the most I would say the most memorable, indescribably gripping experience that I had ever been through. And Albert's reaction to that rejoining of a family showed such incredible personal sensitivity that it has done more than anything else to deepen our friendship and my gratitude to him for having shared that moment with him. Okay, now this 40th birthday, you know, it's interesting. We are still 7 years apart, just as we were then, but it's remarkable what a difference it makes whether you're 33 when somebody else turns 40 as compared with our now being contemporaries. But there's something else to be said, and that's all I want to say. All of my life, I have admired one book more than any other book because it combines humor and general appeal with being really the fundamental guide to basic philosophy. It's Winnie the Pooh. And in Winnie the Pooh, Eeyore says, we can't all, and some of us don't. And that has been the motto of my life that has kept me happy through reverses and everything else. Now, the remarkable thing is that Albert can, and by Jove, he does. And it runs in the family. His cousin, Thor Krugman, is exactly like that. He can and he does. And he's going to tell us now about improved immunogenicity of live measles virus vaccine, implications for control of measles in developing countries. You see, all I can do is mix up the slides.
Walter, not only did you mix up the slides, but I haven't the foggiest idea of what this title means. And I don't plan to utilize this title of improved immunogenicity of live measles vaccine, because when Bob Chanik phoned me to inform me about the subject that I was supposed to discuss, the only thing I heard was measles vaccine, and I said yes. I think a more appropriate title of what I plan to discuss, I thought I had 20 minutes, but it looks as if I better cut it to 15 now, Walter. A more appropriate title would be Measles Vaccine, or Measles Past, Present, and Future. Because you know, while you and Albert were seated at the Hotel Daiichi, is it, 40 years ago in 1946, that's the year that I arrived at the old Willard Parker Hospital. And for the next decade, I had an opportunity with my colleagues of seeing virtually thousands of children with measles. And I was very, very much impressed with the fact that measles was an extremely important disease to try to prevent. The incredible situation is that when I visited many colleagues in Europe, their perception of measles that it was an inevitable disease of childhood, it wasn't important. And when John Enders first isolated measles virus and subsequently, in collaboration with Sam Katz and other colleagues, attenuated it, I'm sure that many of our European colleagues wondered, why go to all of this trouble to try to develop a vaccine for just a routine childhood infection? Well, if they had had my experience at the old Willard Parker Hospital, and you know, if they had attended the 1961 International Conference on Measles, and if they had had an opportunity to hear one of the presentations, this happened to be part of Hilary Kaprowski's presentation, where he talked about the treatment of measles, and I quote, and he stated a very clear statement of how not to treat measles was made in the year 1712. In a letter addressed to the Duchess Sophie, mother of the future George I of England, the Duchess of Orleans and widow of the younger brother of Louis XIV, wrote as follows, quote, "Our misfortune continues. The doctors have made the same mistake treating the little dauphin as they did administering to his mother, the dauphiness. When the child was quite red from rash and perspired profusely, the doctors performed phlebotomy and administered strong emetics. The child died during these operations. Everybody knows that the doctors caused the death of the dauphin. Since his brother, who had the same sickness, was hidden away from the 9 physicians who were busy with his older brother, he was hidden away by the young maids who have given him a little wine and biscuits. Yesterday, while the child had high fever, the doctors wanted also to perform phlebotomy. But his 2 governesses were firmly opposed to the idea, and instead they kept the child warm. This one would have certainly died if the doctors had had their way. I do not understand why they don't learn from experience. Had they no heart when they saw the dauphiness died after phlebotomy and emetics, not to dispose of her child? Well, these governesses also didn't realize, which they could not, that in all probability they were changing the course of the history of France, since the child who survived measles remained after the death of his brother, mother, and father, all within 3 weeks, and all after measles, remained the heir to the French crown, and who later, as Louis XV, was not the best occupant of the throne. Thus, the moral of this story of the treatment of measles can be summarized in one motto: avoid physicians and thou wilt be cured. That gives you an impression how important it was to try to prevent measles. And as many of you know, the live attenuated measles virus vaccine was licensed for use in this country in 1963. For the period of 1954, when John Enders first isolated the virus, and then it was attenuated, and all extensive studies were carried out, by 1963, we did indeed have a live attenuated vaccine. And as you'll see in this first, or maybe second slide, that the strategy in this country was to try to immunize as many infants as possible, trying to reach, hopefully, 90 or more % of the population of infants. And the extraordinary situation that occurred was that prior to the time that the vaccine was licensed for use in this country in 1963, like clockwork, every year there were approximately 500,000 or more reported cases of measles. As a matter of fact, I recall one year when there were about 800,000 reported cases of measles. And yet, after extensive use of the vaccine, as you can see in 1963, the bottom virtually dropped out of this disease. There was not only a dramatic decline in the number of reported cases of measles, but a virtual disappearance of post-measles encephalitis. And when in 1965 it became very clear that one of the complications of measles was SSPE, and fortunately it happened in 65 and not in 63, because one of the postulations, the speculations, was that perhaps an attenuated measles vaccine would be more prone to be associated with the occurrence of SSPE. But by that time, many millions of children had received the vaccine, and as the program continued, as you can see, SSPE has declined so that it's virtually disappeared. Well, you're looking at the good news, because this slide indicates what has happened in this country with an extensive program, so that by 82, 83, and then 84, the number of reported cases of measles had declined to levels of no more than about, in round numbers, 2,500. What does it mean? It means a 99.5 or more % reduction in the incidence of measles. But to those of you who have read the MMWR, distributed by CDC, and if you listen to your TV and your radio, you know that things have changed in 1985 and in 1986. And instead of having, at the end of this year, no more than about 2,000 some odd reported cases, without question, we will reach at least 5,000 reported cases in this country. Now, that 5,000 reported cases is creating a concern. But let me put this in perspective. 5,000 reported cases, instead of representing 99.5 or more percent reduction, is 99% decline in reduction of measles. But we have a clue here. Is it the fact that something has happened to the protective efficacy of these studies carried out with measles vaccine, or is it something else? I'd like to suggest that the probability is it's not the vaccine, but it's the strategy. And it's a strategy that we have to be concerned about not only in this country, where I don't consider this a significant problem, but even more so in developing areas of the world. And this is a slide taken from one of the papers by CDC, and these are WHO statistics, showing that if you forget about the several developed areas of the world where measles is very well under control, it's been estimated that there are anywhere between 1.5 million to 2 million world measles deaths in the entire world. The fact that there are 4,100 per day and 170 per hour and 2.8 per minute and 1 every 21 seconds, this sounds very dramatic, but there's no question about the fact that measles worldwide is a very important problem. And this is one of the reasons I'm so delighted to have this opportunity to talk about measles, because most of my involvement with measles has been involvement with measles and measles vaccine in the United States. But fortunately, Cousin Albert has come into the picture now. And as many of you know, within the last 3 or 4 years, he has been very much concerned about this situation. And believe it or not, Albert and I agree on the strategy that should be carried out. We've had our disagreements, but when it comes to strategy for measles, we're in the same ballpark. Now, one of the very important things that has to be done before we dismiss the fact that the measles vaccine, like the naturally acquired disease, in all probability will cause lasting immunity, is to review some studies that were carried out some years ago, where we had an opportunity to observe somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40 or 50 children. And we had an opportunity to observe them before, during, and as long as 16 years after they had naturally acquired measles. And this gave us then an opportunity to see the striking variation in the antibody response. These are hemagglutination inhibition antibody responses. And here are 2 children. Both had a significant rise in measles antibody within 1 month. But note, one extreme, you have a child who 16 years later who still has detectable good levels of measles antibody. And down here you have a child who by 8 years with a highly sensitive HI test had a titer of 2. Now, in most laboratories, if it's less than 4 or less than 8, it's presumed that a child is susceptible. This child who had no more than 2 or 4 is just as immune as a child who had the high levels of antibody. How can I say this? I can say this because I've had an opportunity to observe children like this in outbreaks of measles. What happens? They get a transient anamnestic response, but it comes right back to where it was before. So that what you're looking at here is the pattern of the antibody response following naturally acquired measles. Now, this gives us a good background for observing what happens following the live, further attenuated measles virus vaccine. And here's another example. These are 2 examples out of about 70 children whom we observed. Both of these children had about the same response 1 month after receiving the further attenuated vaccine. This child, 16 years later, had good levels of antibody. The other extreme is a child who, by the 6th or 7th year, had declined to levels that we measured with our macro HI test, the 2, and then eventually had no detectable antibody. But when we gave an inoculation of vaccine to this child on 14 years later, and when we took samples of serum a week and 2 weeks later, it was very clear that within 1 week there was this anamnestic response. But let me emphasize that by 2 or 3 months, it was right down to where it was before, less than 1 to 2. Are these children susceptible to measles? There is no evidence that they are. The incubation period is such that that anamnestic response, that recall in antibody, at least in an immunocompetent individual, in my opinion, is adequate enough to protect them. Now, here we have the situation where we compared the geometric mean antibody titers following natural infection and immunization. And it's been known for many years that the antibody levels are much higher following naturally acquired infection than they are following the administration of the further attenuated vaccine. But is it important? Again, based on data that we have accumulated over the years, it isn't important, provided that you know that initially this particular child did indeed respond to the vaccine. Because if you don't know whether the child did or did not respond to the vaccine, you never know if this was a child who received vaccine that was inactivated for some reason, whether it be refrigeration or other matter, or whether the vaccine was given at an age when there was still maternal antibody. Now, here we have the measles antibody response following the vaccine, and show again the effect of reimmunization, as I mentioned a few moments ago. This particular child received the vaccine in November of 1961. And note the variation in response. I showed you a child before where 16 years later there was still good levels of antibody. But in this particular child, certainly by 3 and by 4 years, there were no detectable. Antibody was not detectable. And yet, when that inoculation of vaccine was given, and when samples of serum were obtained 1 week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and 8 weeks, note that the peak level of antibody was about 2 weeks, unlike primary infection where the peak level is somewhere around 4 to 6 weeks. But then again, by 8 weeks, and I can tell you later, it declined to undetectable levels. Why is this important? It's important because it tells us that serologic tests may or may not indicate that a particular person is indeed susceptible or immune. CDC has done a study to try to determine the health and economic benefits of measles immunization in the United States, and they've estimated that in the 20-year period between 1963 and 1985, that they've prevented about 52 million cases of measles, about 5,200 deaths, and about 17,400 cases of mental retardation because of the encephalitis that was prevented. They calculate also that the net savings during this period was of the order of about $5.1 billion. Now that brings me to the present era, to Albert's involvement with measles. Albert, as many of you know, has been involved in studies that have been carried out in Brazil, and he's been not only intensely interested in this problem of measles in developing areas of the world and in other countries that are not developing where measles is still a cause of serious morbidity and mortality. And as many of you know, he pioneered a new way of going about trying to prevent measles in these areas, because we've known for many years that in many of these developing areas of the world, measles is a very prevalent disease during the first year of life, especially between roughly 5 and 9 months of age. The current vaccines that are available to us are not immunogenic during the period of time when babies still have maternal antibody. And so his hope was that with the development of another mode of utilizing the measles vaccine, the aerosolization, perhaps this would be effective in breaking through the barrier that, in all probability, maternal antibody presents to carry out, to then successfully immunize infants in a younger age group. So that he has pioneered these studies. In addition to that, he's done extensive studies utilizing other vaccines, other than the currently available further attenuated vaccines. He's also reevaluated, because there have been many other studies carried out elsewhere, with the Edmundston Zagreb strain of measles vaccine. His studies are terribly important because he's raised an important issue, and that is it really possible to try to determine if one can successfully immunize young infants and young children in this very vulnerable period of about, let's say, 6 months, 5, 6, or 7 months. And some highly suggestive evidence has been accumulated which indicates that perhaps the Edmundston Zagreb strain is indeed more immunogenic than others, but it isn't definite. And I think we shall know the answer to the question in the not-too-distant future. Because what is happening now is, as a result of Albert's stimulation, there is a study that has been designed, that CDC is involved with, that will be carried out in Mexico in the not-too-distant future. We're utilizing 2 different doses of the Edmundston Zagreb strain, whether 5,000 tissue culture infectious doses and 30,000, comparing that with large doses of the further attenuated vaccine. And when these studies are completed, I think then we will really know whether there is a difference in the strain or whether it is just a matter of dose. But I think one of the important contributions that Albert will make is in the point of view of strategy. And in my opinion, and I agree with him completely, that it is a strategy that is terribly important for the control of measles. I have felt for many years, and each year, like clockwork, when I attend the ACIP committee meetings, I've felt strongly that we cannot rely in this country on giving 1 dose of measles vaccine, even though under ideal circumstances it's highly immunogenic. Because I know that out in the real world, things happen. The vaccine isn't refrigerated adequately. There are breaks in technique, so that we can expect at least a 5 to 10% non-response. But what does it mean? It means that if you have 3 million children receiving vaccine each year, and if they don't respond, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 150 to 300,000 are not going to have a take. And if they are only supposed to get 1 dose of vaccine, since we've eliminated major epidemics of measles at a later date, when they are teenagers, and where there's a mini outbreak of measles, whether in a college or in a high school, they will then be susceptible, and this is actually what has happened. I have suggested for a number of years now that not because the vaccine is, the protection of the vaccine is transient. I believe that if there is a take, with rare exceptions, possibly in immunocompromised individuals, that there should be lasting immunity. But because of these breaks in technique, I think to try to achieve better control of measles, it will be important at some time in the future to do what is now being carried out, or has been for several years now, in Czechoslovakia, in Sweden, and in Finland, where 2 doses of vaccine are being given, 1 during the early period and another one later. Very recently, Albert was heavily involved in the program in Brazil, where for many years measles has been a significant problem. Now, Albert always, as a member of the family, I get many of his papers even before they're submitted for publication. And I don't have his permission to read what I'm going to read now, but I'm sure you won't object, Albert, because I think this highlights what you've described about the situation in Brazil, and it's only about a page and a half. It highlights the kind of strategy that will be essential to control measles. Be terribly important to know what the epidemiologic circumstances are in the respective country. What's good for Brazil may not be good for one of the African countries or one of the other countries. But this is what Albert summarized in his forthcoming paper on the impact of routine increased vaccine coverage during the first year of life and additional coverage among children under 2 years of age, under 5 years of age, and this is a study that he's been involved with in Brazil. And he states, however inaccurate and incomplete data are on the morbidity and mortality of measles, it is evident that routine vaccination, concentrating on infants during the first year of life, while undoubtedly protecting many children, has failed to prevent continuing circulation of the virus with associated morbidity, mortality, and recurrent epidemics. And as far as can be judged from the data collected by the states of Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Minas Gerais, and Rio Grande do Sul, with a combined total population of almost half of all Brazil, the mass administration of measles vaccine to children without cards certifying previous vaccination, mostly 23 months of age in 1984 and 9 to 59 months of age in 1985, concurrently with oral polio vaccine during the national days of anti-polio vaccination, did not have the desired impact. But a unique impact was obtained in the state of Rio de Janeiro, in which a national day of vaccination only against measles was carried out in May 1985. In this study, all children 9 months to 5 years of age, regardless of previous evidence of vaccination, they were involved in the study, and the effect was immediate in June, July, and August, when the seasonal increase in measles cases occurs in Rio de Janeiro. And although death certificates for measles practically disappeared, and the number of children with measles admitted to hospitals dropped by 90% or more, there were still cases of measles that were notified. And when Albert analyzed the age distribution of the reported cases of measles in Rio, in spite of this extensive use of the vaccine, and he found that during the past 5 years, surprisingly, 30 to 40% of children admitted to hospital with measles were over 5 years of age, up to 15 years of age. So that if you have a mass immunization program and you cut it off at about 5 years of age, you have this susceptible population. And so it became significantly obvious that one could not hope to interrupt the chain of transmission of measles virus without including 5 to 10-year-old children in an initial mass vaccination program with measles vaccine where such susceptibility persists. The state of Rio de Janeiro has just embarked on such a program of vaccination in the kindergarten and school. And the impact of this program, plus the plans for a national day of measles vaccination in 1986 for new children, will have reached 9 months of age or who missed being vaccinated in 1985. Albert has been sitting here and he hasn't been able to say anything, and as a very close cousin of his, I felt his voice had to be heard too. Albert, I agree with you. It's been really a pleasure and a joy for me to have this opportunity to not only attend this conference, but to participate in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Dr. James Horgel, who has given us the most beautiful, intimate portraits of poliovirus that have ever been seen. And he will, I'm sure, show us some of them and speak on the three-dimensional structure of poliovirus. I don't know whether you want to put it on
I think I'm going to be the first speaker today not to do any reminiscing. I think that's particularly appropriate considering my short career. Also, David Baltimore has told me he'll pull the plug if I do. At the risk of having the plug pulled, I'd like to say, though, that having worked on the structure of poliovirus has been particularly satisfying, largely in part because of the large amount of characterization of the virus that's gone on in the past. I'd like to offer thanks to many of you here who have provided either directly the information or the impetus for the information to become available. Thank you. The first thing I'd like to do, rather than show any individual still pictures of poliovirus, is to cue up a movie that we've recently produced. I've been told by people that have seen it that it makes much more sense than if I rattle on for 40 minutes or so from slides. So if we could bring on the movie, have the lights out, please. Can we roll the movie? I think it's going to need to be focused. If you focus on the lines on the grid. The first picture here is a picture of the intact virion dot surface representation of it. I think the first thing to take home is the fact that the virus has a great deal more surface relief than we'd have ever thought from looking at electron micrographs. Here what we show is a cutout cross-section of it. We can see very large surface protrusions, and in fact, they're below the resolution of an electron micrograph. Here, an IgG molecule and a molecule of trypsin are shown for comparison. At its outermost, the particle has a radius of about 165 angstroms at the outermost peaks. But the outer surface, in fact, goes in as deep as 137 angstroms. The inside of the particle, the inner of the protein shell, is about 100 angstroms in diameter, in radius rather, minimum. 118 angstrom maximum radius. This is a protein shell. In fact, it's very small. The interior is the volume occupied by RNA, which unfortunately in our experiments is transparent. A size comparison here is shown molecule of tRNA, the only molecule of RNA for which we have a full three-dimensional structure, 76 nucleotides compared to 7,500 for the polio RNA. The subunit positions of the major capsid proteins VP1, VP2, and VP3 here are shown with color codes. VP1 is blue, VP2 is yellow, and VP3 is red. First, we're blending in 5 in the pentamer, and here all 60 subunits in the virus. The particle symmetry is icosahedral. It has the symmetry of the regular solid, the icosahedron. You see here a 5-fold axis. VP1 packs around the 5-fold axis. A 3-fold axis coming out of the triangular face. VP2 and VP3 alternate around the 3-fold. And a 2-fold axis coming out of the edge of the icosahedron. Going to a schematic representation of the subunits here, VP1 in blue, now VP2 and VP0, which is VP2 and VP4 in yellow, VP3 in red. An individual protomer first assembles to form a pentameric 14S subunit. And they assemble to form a capsid. Now, this is something actually we've been able to reproduce in vitro. We and others have been able to reproduce in vitro. As yet, we've not been able to take individual subunits and put RNA inside. Here, the subunits themselves are shown in detail alpha carbon models, first on the surface and then pulled out in isolation, VP1, VP2, and VP4, and VP3. As most of you are aware, the polio protein is produced by making first a very large polyprotein from a unique start to unique stop on the genome, about 220,000 molecular weight. It's then cleaved into 3 precursor proteins, and then the N-terminal protein into the capsid proteins VP0, VP3, VP1. VP0 is finally cleaved into VP2 and VP4. The individual subunits, VP1, VP2, and VP3, have a very similar core structure, which is an stranded antiparallel beta barrel. And the core, in fact, is not only similar between the 3 proteins in polio, it's also very similar, surprisingly, to the capsid proteins seen in plant viruses. Here is shown a schematic representation of the beta barrel in one of the standard formats shown for protein structures. In spite of the similarity of the cores, they have some dissimilarities in the structure, including different terminal extensions at the end termini and different connecting loops. This distinguishes the 3 proteins. Now, in the virus, the cores, these beta barrels, form the closed shell of the virus, with VP1 pointing toward the 5-fold and VP2 and 3 pointing to the 3-fold axes. And the plant virus had very, very similar cores, and they have similar packings of the core in the virion. The N-terminal extensions form an internal network, which we believe helps to direct the assembly of the virus. And in particular, in some detail here, is shown a network formed by the N-terminus of VP3 together with a short stretch of, at the N-terminus of VP4, which forms a tube structure near the 5-fold axis. This is shown in the context of the rest of the internal network. The loops, dissimilar loops, form much of the external surface of the virus, and in fact, as we'll see, form the antigenic sites. Now, these are the antigenic sites determined by looking at sequence changes in monoclonal release mutations. First, all the sites, and now one particular site which we've mapped by closeness and position on the particle. This site has been seen to dominate the response in mice to type 2 and type 3 poliovirus. A second site, which is clustered near the 2-fold axis, comprised of a loop of VP1 and a loop of VP2. And a third site, which is comprised of components of all 3 subunits, which clusters around the 3-fold axis. Now, the clustering of these sites has, in fact, been confirmed by mapping a cross-neutralization matrix of proteins. Surprisingly, sites 2 and 3 dominate the response to type 1 in a way that we don't really totally understand. Here again, all the sites are shown. We see that the antigenic sites occur on the outermost exposed portions of the virus, and in fact, these ridges define a series of valleys, which are probable sites for the receptor recognition site. I'd like to acknowledge especially the contribution to Dave Philman, who's been instrumental in this work, and Marie Chow, who supplied us with all the virus. And then in the making of the movie, the assistance of Dan Block, who directed and produced the movie, and Arthur Olson, who's really truly a wizard at creating visual productions. I've often thought that making a movie of high production quality should come second to the science. In fact, what I've seen in the past is that without the production quality, in fact, no one pays any attention to the science. So that's the end of the movie. We are planning on making this movie available. I think the final take of it is, in fact, being shot today. There will be a distribution setup. Anyone who's interested need only to write to me, and I'll attempt to make sure that you get a copy at somewhere near the cost of printing. Okay, one of the things that comes up when you're making movies, first of all, there's a target length, and we're slightly under the target length, but eventually about 10 minutes is all you can really expect an audience to pay attention to a movie. One of the limitations in that, there's a limitation of what you can show, both time constraints and also the fact that there's a limitation in the amount of text you can put up. So what I think I'd like to do, there's one other problem, is that eventually you have to put a movie to bed with the information you have at the time. And there are always exciting new things that you'd like to talk about, but you can't put them into an old cut of the movie. So what I'd like to do in the time remaining is just talk about some of the things that I think need to be expanded on that are in fact been covered in the movie first, and then talk about some of the new things that we've been doing. Right, I guess I operate this, the first slide. When we first started working on the crystal structure, and I should say that the structure that we've done so far has been of the Mahoney strain of type 1 poliovirus. We're presently expanding these studies. I'm about a third of the way through collecting data on the Savin strain of type 3. We have crystals that apparently now diffract of the Savin strain of type 1, and I'm working desperately to work on the Lansing strain of type 2, but so far that's proved refractory. I think probably most of the generalities of the structure are going to be very, very similar between the strains. There will be subtle differences, and what we hope to define is just how subtle those differences really are. When we first began working on poliovirus, there were some concerns that I thought would be particularly addressable by having structural information. One of them is assembly. The other one is immunology, immune recognition, and the mechanism of neutralization. The third would be the process of attachment and penetration of the virus. This, I think, is particularly interesting. There's good evidence that there are receptor-mediated specificities in the attachment, and the process by which a naked virus gets inside a cell is as yet poorly understood. And finally, a question of neurovirulence and neurotropism and attenuation. I'm not so naive as to think that the virion itself produces all the answers to this, but I do think that some of the evidence coming from studying, in particular, mouse models, says that the virion itself can have some role in determining tropism, and we would hope to be able to define some of this eventually in the future. I think as the movie has shown, we've gone partway to talking about understanding some questions in assembly. We've begun to understand the question of immune recognition. It's going to take an awful lot more modeling and study to determine how it is that some antibodies are actually capable of neutralizing the infectivity of the virus. We're just beginning to address in structural terms the question of attachment and penetration, and these are some of the things I'd like to talk about today. And I think at this stage we're just beginning to formulate ideas of how we'd like to ask questions in the area of neurovirulence. In fact, I think that the important thing about thinking about the structure is that it not only provides a framework for interpreting previous results, but I think it will provide a framework for design of future experiments and their interpretation. I hope to convey some of that today.